Welcome to my channel.
And this is English Podcast Station.
Ever get that feeling? Like you're speaking English, the words are right, grammar's not a disaster, but it just sounds off.
Yeah, I think we've all been there. You can tell something's missing, but more vocabulary or grammar rules just don't seem to be the answer.
Right. Like you're understood, but not quite in the way you want.
Exactly. And for a lot of learners, the missing ingredient is the way their voice rises and falls as they speak.
The musicality of English. Intonation.
Precisely. And today, we're diving deep into that. Specifically, we're drawing on episode 13 of the IELTS podcast, which focused on improving English intonation with podcasts. This is going to be your shortcut to sounding more natural and confident.
Because let's face it, intonation isn't just a nice to have.
Not at all. It's fundamental for clear communication. It's what gives life and nuance to your words.
Think of it like this. The phrase, I'm going. If I say it flatly, I'm going, it's just a statement. But I'm going, with that voice going up at the end, turns it into a question. Or I'm going. Bam. Excitement. All because of intonation.
And this is where a lot of learners hit a snag. You might be acing vocabulary and grammar, but that melody of speech, that intonation, gets left behind.
Yeah, the IELTS podcast mentioned a few reasons why that happens.
Yeah.
A flat, monotonous tone, not enough variation in pitch. Or maybe you're unconsciously using the intonation patterns from your native language, which might not work the same way in English.
Exactly. And these can lead to sounding a bit unnatural, or worse, being completely misunderstood.
So today we're unpacking the whole thing, making it clear, practical, and giving you some real takeaways to boost your confidence when speaking English.
And this is for everyone, not just advanced learners prepping for the IELTS. No matter where you're at on your English journey, understanding intonation makes a huge difference.
So let's start with the basics. What exactly is intonation?
Well, simply put, it's how your voice rises and falls while you speak, like the melody of a song. Those shifts in pitch convey meaning, emotions, and even your attitude.
It's the unspoken layer of communication.
Right. And the IELTS podcast highlighted 4 main intonation patterns in English that are super useful to be aware of.
Let's hear them.
First up, falling intonation. Your voice drops at the end of a phrase or sentence like, "Oh, weather's beautiful," or asking, "Where did you go on vacation?"
Makes sense. It kind of signals that the thought is complete. Finality.
Absolutely. You'll hear it in statements and those questions. The big thing is to avoid a rising tone with these.
Why? What happens then?
It can sound uncertain, like you're not confident in what you're saying.
Got it. So, next pattern.
Rising intonation, where your voice goes up at the end. It's your go-to for yes-no questions. Are you coming? Is that clear? It almost begs for a response.
And those tag questions too, right?
Yep.
You're ready, aren't you?
Spot on. Using a rising tone for other types of questions can sound a little strange in English, though.
Okay, so what's the third pattern?
Rising, falling intonation. Your voice goes up and then back down. This is useful for you in giving choices. Coffee or tea, or expressing surprise like, really?
Or emphasizing something like, that's incredible.
Precisely. Notice how it directs attention to the important information.
Okay, and the last one.
Level intonation. This is where your voice stays pretty flat. Think of someone trailing off, lost in thought, I'm not sure, or listing items, milk, bread, and eggs. It conveys neutrality or a lack of strong emotion.
Like, maybe.
Exactly. Now, it's important to see how intonation links with stress and rhythm.
Okay, let's break that down.
Stress is the emphasis you put on specific syllables or words. Rhythm is the pattern of those stressed and unstressed bits, giving English its flow.
So if we think of English as a song, intonation's the overall melody, stress is like hitting certain notes harder, and rhythm's the beat that keeps it all together.
Brilliant analogy. And guess what? These patterns, they can be wildly different across languages.
So what sounds natural in, say, Spanish might sound totally weird in English.
Exactly. And that's why learning English intonation is about more than sounding good. It's about being understood correctly.
Makes sense. Now, there's another fascinating aspect to this, right? The link between intonation and emotions.
Definitely. Your voice naturally changes when you're excited, right? It goes up. When you're serious or sad, it often falls.
Yeah, you can practically hear someone's mood in their voice sometimes.
Right. So by learning and using these patterns, you can express yourself better in English. Your communication becomes richer, more impactful.
Like adding another dimension to your speech. Okay, let's dive deeper into those basic intonation patterns with some more examples.
Okay, let's revisit falling intonation. Think about stating a simple fact. The meeting is tomorrow. Hear how your voice naturally falls at the end. It's final, definitive.
And what about those questions?
Same idea. Where's the conference room? Your voice goes down on room.
Yep.
Another example. I'm going to finish this report today. Downward slide on today. Clear intention.
Got it. Now, rising intonation. This is key for those yes/no questions, right?
Absolutely. Imagine someone asks, do you enjoy learning English? That English at the end, your voice goes up, inviting a yes or no.
Like you're leaving the door open for them to answer.
Precisely. And those tag questions, you've studied this before, haven't you? That haven't you, up it goes. Or simply, will you be there? Upward pitch on there.
Okay, on to rising falling.
This one is fantastic for emphasis. Let's say you're telling a story and you say, it was a fantastic trip. That rise on fantastic, then the fall, it really highlights how good the trip was.
Or if you're given a choice like, would you rather go to the beach or the mountains?
Exactly, up and down on both beach and mountains. Or you could say, you did what? Expressing surprise, that would be rising falling too.
Okay, got it. Level intonation, last but not least.
Think of pausing to think, like, let me see, how can I explain this? The let me see stays pretty level. Or listing things but not finishing yet. For this project, we'll need markers, paper. That first part, level, then maybe the intonation changes as you list the last few items.
All right, it's like a holding pattern before you give the full info. Now, we've talked about these basic patterns, but how can you go beyond that? To express more subtle stuff like disagreement or certainty.
This is where it gets really interesting. You can use intonation to show your attitude and emotions more subtly. For example, a slight falling intonation can express certainty. Like if you say, I'm confident that this is the best approach, that slight fall on approach makes it stronger.
So it's like a subtle way of saying, I'm sure about this. What about disagreement then?
If you want to disagree gently, you might use a slight rising intonation. Say someone proposes something you're not totally on board with. You could respond with, that's an interesting idea, but I'm not sure it would work. That slight rise on work hints at your doubt.
That's a great tactic. So by mastering these nuances, you can really add depth to your English.
Absolutely. And remember, while flat intonation can signal sarcasm, in most situations, it's best to avoid anything that could come across as insincere. Instead, focus on using these variations thoughtfully to add meaning and show you're actively engaged in the conversation.
Okay, so we've covered the basics and some advanced stuff. Now let's zoom in on intonation in conversational English. This is where it gets really practical.
Right. So think about how you use intonation in everyday chats, like short, rising intonations show you're listening. Oh, really? That's amazing. It keeps the conversation flowing.
And when you're telling a story, you naturally vary your pitch to build suspense or emphasize key points. Faster pace, higher pitch for excitement, slower and lower for something sad. Right.
Exactly. And using rising intonation can signal that you're not finished speaking or invite someone else to jump in. It's all about turn taking.
It's like the unspoken dance of conversation.
Exactly. And think about how intonation reveals agreement or disagreement. A flat yes, a questioning yes, a strong falling yes. It can even make your request sound more polite. Could you please pass the salt? That rising intonation at the end softens it.
So much meaning packed into those tiny changes in pitch.
Right. And the best way to get a feel for all this is by listening to native speakers. Pay attention to their intonation. Try to mimic those patterns. It's like learning by osmosis.
Okay, let's switch gears a bit and talk about the IELTS. How does intonation play into that, specifically for the speaking test?
So in the IELTS speaking test, intonation is crucial for fluency and coherence, and ultimately your score. Remember, examiners aren't just listening for correct grammar and vocab, they're also assessing how natural and fluid you sound.
So using a wider range of intonation actually helps you get a better band score.
Absolutely. It makes you sound more engaging, less robotic, and this is true across all parts of the test.
Let's break it down by part then. Starting with part 1, the personal interview.
Okay, in part 1, you're answering questions about yourself. Using that enthusiastic, rising intonation when talking about things you enjoy makes you sound more genuine. Like, if you're asked about your hobbies, you could say, I absolutely love playing basketball on the weekends. That upward lift on weekends shows your passion.
It's like letting your personality come through, even in a formal test. What about part 2, the long turn where you speak for 2 minutes?
In part 2, rising falling intonation is your friend. It helps emphasize key moments in your story. Like, the most amazing part was when we finally reached the top of the mountain. That rise on top and fall on mountain emphasizes the climax.
It makes it more dramatic and captivating.
Exactly. And varying your pitch keeps the listener hooked for the full 2 minutes.
And lastly, part 3, the discussion section.
This is where using balanced intonation to show you're considering different perspectives is key. When discussing complex topics, you might say, on the one hand, it's beneficial, but on the other hand, there are some drawbacks. That slight rise and fall on those contrasting phrases shows you can think critically.
It adds that extra layer of nuance.
Exactly. And using rising intonation to ask clarifying questions of the examiner shows you're actively listening and engaged.
So just like you practice your vocabulary and grammar for the IELTS, you need to practice your intonation too.
Precisely. It's a valuable investment in your overall score.
Okay, so we've covered why it's important, the basic patterns, and some more advanced techniques. Now let's get down to brass tacks. What exercises and resources can you recommend for improving English intonation, especially for the IELTS?
Well, the first thing is to actively listen to native speakers. Podcasts, interviews, even casual conversations. Don't just hear the words, listen to the melody. Notice how their pitch changes in different situations.
So train your ear to that natural rhythm and flow.
Exactly. And make sure you understand those 4 basic patterns we discussed. Knowing when and how to use them gives you a strong foundation.
Recording yourself speaking is a classic language learning tip. How does that apply to intonation?
It's super valuable. Record yourself practicing IELTS speaking questions. It lets you hear your own intonation and spot areas that sound flat or unnatural.
So you become your own critic. What should you do after you've recorded yourself?
Listen critically to your intonation. Compare it to recordings of native speakers answering similar questions. Are you using enough variation? Are your questions ending with a rising tone?
Are your statements sounding confident with that falling tone?
Exactly.
There are a lot of online tools and apps for language learning. Are there any specifically for intonation feedback?
While there aren't many that focus solely on intonation, some pronunciation apps analyze pitch and rhythm. But honestly, careful listening in comparison to native speakers is the most effective way.
What about shadowing? Repeating what a native speaker says in real time.
Shadowing is fantastic. Listen to a segment from a podcast or anything in English and try to repeat it simultaneously, mimicking their pitch and rhythm as closely as possible.
Like a vocal workout for your intonation.
Precisely. And don't forget about good old-fashioned mimicry. Pick phrases from IELTS samples or other English audio and try to copy the speaker's intonations, stress, and rhythm perfectly.
And resources like online dictionaries with audio pronunciation, those can be helpful too, right?
Definitely. They help you hear correct word intonation, which is a building block.
Anything specific to recommend for IELTS prep?
Yes. Use those IELTS preparation materials with sample speaking tests and audio recordings of high-scoring candidates. Pay close attention to their intonation and analyze why they use certain patterns.
And of course, practice.
Absolutely. Practice regularly, even for short bursts. It's more effective than infrequent marathon sessions. And remember, mistakes are part of the process. The more you practice, the more natural and confident your intonation will become.
Great advice. To wrap this up, what are the key takeaways for our listeners, especially those preparing for the IELTS?
Remember that intonation is just as vital as grammar and vocabulary, especially for the IELTS. We've covered those 4 main patterns: falling, rising, rising, falling, and level, and how they're used in different situations.
And how using varied intonation can boost your fluency and coherence scores, making you sound more natural and engaging.
Exactly. We also discussed practical techniques for improvement, from listening to native speakers to recording yourself and utilizing IELTS-specific resources. Consistent practice and learning from mistakes are your keys to success.
So for everyone gearing up for the IELTS, actively practice your intonation. Pay attention to native speakers, experiment, and don't be afraid to step out of your comfort zone.
Right. By mastering the melody of English, you'll improve your IELTS score and become a more confident communicator overall.
That wraps up our deep dive into the fascinating world of English intonation. We hope this has armed you with valuable insights and practical steps for your language learning journey.
And as a final thought, think about how the intonation used by IELTS examiners themselves might subtly guide your understanding of their questions. Does their melody give you extra clues about what they're looking for in your response? It's something interesting to consider as you continue practicing.
That's a great point. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of English intonation. We hope you found it useful.
Our pleasure. Keep practicing.